900 years ago, aliens left 47 monsters on Earth to kill the last humans alive. Today, those same monsters are standing between humanity and the aliens who created them. Dr. Mara Osibansu knew this before she even pulled up her chair. She had been tracking the trajectory for 6 weeks, long enough to do the math 3 times and refuse to believe it each time. The signal carried a frequency modulation that matched no natural phenomenon in the known catalog. It was also unmistakably the same frequency as the things that slept beneath her feet. She pressed her palm flat on the cold steel of her console and listened to the mountain breathe. Somewhere deep in the rock below, the Kumasi Highland Observatory, 300 meters of carved granite and poured concrete separated her from the thing they called First Grandmother. She was sleeping now, as she often did in winter. Her heat signature was a slow, warm pulse on Mara's seismic monitor, like a heartbeat, which was exactly what it felt like to everyone who had ever seen the readings and not believed them. "They're coming back," Mara said to no one. Her assistant, a 17-year-old boy named Kofi who had taken the apprenticeship because it kept him out of the wind tunnels, looked up from his tablet. "Who is?" She turned from the monitor and looked at him for a long moment. In the glow of the screen, she could see the bead necklace around his throat. The same red and gold pattern his grandmother had worn. Her grandmother's grandmother before that. All the way back to the women who had lived in the ruins and learned not to run from the dark. "Go wake First Grandmother," Mara said, gently, "the way your mother taught you." Kofi didn't ask questions. That was the first thing they taught you here. Some questions were for later. He put down his tablet and walked toward the shaft. Mara turned back to the signal. 904 years. Long enough for empires to assume they had won. She allowed herself 1 full minute of fear. Then she got to work. There is a version of this story that begins with war, and it is the wrong version. The war was barely a war. That is the honest thing. The thing that historians in the old archives recorded with a clinical precision that made it more brutal to read, not less. It was not a battle between equals. It was an erasure. The Vielle arrived in 7 ships that moved like they were embarrassed by the effort, like crossing 30 light years was roughly equivalent to a long commute. Their weapons did not fire projectiles. They did not need to. They rewrote the molecular cohesion of whatever they pointed them at, and things simply stopped being solid. They dismantled 3 cities in the first hour, not to make a point. To clear space for orbital positioning. The point came later. The human governments, what was left of the United Nations framework, the African Union, the Pacific Cooperative, the scattered remnants of whatever you wanted to call the Northern Hemisphere's governance structures. Attempted contact 17 times in the first 4 days. The Vielle responded to the 16th attempt, which was the first one transmitted on the correct frequency. Their response was brief. It was UNC. Their response was brief. It was, according to the surviving translation, something approximating the following: "You are noted. Compliance will reduce the duration of the process." There was no negotiation. There was no declaration of war and no formal surrender. There was a process. Humanity was a problem to be processed. The Vielle's logic, as it would eventually be understood, was impersonal. They were not cruel, the way a boot is not cruel when it comes down on an insect. They were thorough. Earth sat at the intersection of 2 expansion vectors they had mapped 400 years prior, and humans were a species at what they called the threshold stage, advanced enough to be a nuisance, primitive enough to be dismissed. The Vielle had encountered 11 other threshold species in their expansion. They had a protocol. The protocol was simple. Reduce the population to below viable recovery numbers. remove all significant infrastructure, and quarantine the planet with autonomous deterrents. Wait, return in a few centuries to a quiet world with usable real estate. It had worked 11 times before. For 63 days, the Vial executed their protocol with flawless efficiency. They did not hate the humans who ran from them. They did not enjoy killing. They simply continued, city by city, settlement by settlement. The cold arithmetic of extinction. By the end of the 63rd day, they estimated the surviving human population at somewhere between 300,000 and 450,000 individuals, scattered across remote highlands, deep forests, island chains, underground shelters. Too spread out to be worth the energy cost of finding all of them. The protocol didn't require total extinction immediately. That was what the deterrents were for. The Vial fleet commander, whose name translates roughly as Vain Sot Orek, though humans who later studied the records simply called him the architect, stood on the bridge of the primary ship and reviewed the deployment manifest for the deterrents. He was satisfied with the numbers. He had done this before. He would do it again. He did not think about the people below. This was not cruelty. It was simply the way he thought. The Veil were not a species with much patience for other people's inner lives. It had never been necessary. He approved the manifest. 47 autonomous deterrent units, the Vial called them Kirath, which meant something like final silence, were deployed from orbit. They fell through the atmosphere like burning seeds. Each one was a masterpiece of alien engineering, 12 meters tall, 6-legged with sensory arrays, capable of detecting human biosignatures at 4 kilometers, and weapons that made the question of survival largely rhetorical. They were designed to last 300 years minimum. They were designed to learn, to adapt, to hunt. They were designed to be completely inhuman, in every possible sense of the word. The architect watched them fall. He checked his calculations one last time. He ordered his ships away from Earth's orbit. He did not look back. In 400 years, some surveyor crew would swing by and collect the real estate. Easy work. Clean. He was good at his job. The early years are hard to talk about without a particular kind of grief, the kind that settles into the chest like sediment. The survivors were, to put it plainly, the ones who were already good at surviving, subsistence farmers in the Ethiopian highlands who had watched drought and war cycle through their lands for generations and learned the deep grammar of endurance. Deep wilderness communities in Amazonia and the Congo Basin who had spent centuries being largely invisible to the world that was now ash. Island peoples across the Pacific who could read weather in cloud formations and fish by starlight, and had always treated the ocean not as a barrier but as a road. They found each other slowly, cautiously. The first years the Kirath were terrifying. Mara would later read the accounts, translated from a dozen languages and dialects, preserved in handwritten logs and oral traditions, and eventually, centuries later, in the formal archives. The accounts were consistent in certain details. The sound, a deep rhythmic concussion, like a heartbeat amplified through rock. The heat, they ran warm, the Kirath, especially their limb joints, and on cold nights you could sometimes see the shimmer of heat rising above the tree line 3 kilometers away, and know one was nearby. The way they moved, not like animals, not quite. Too deliberate, too intelligent. They paused sometimes in ways that animals didn't, in ways that suggested they were thinking, assessing, calculating. The early survivors lost people. There is no softening this. In the first decade, the human population continued to fall. Disease, starvation, the Kirath. Some accounts from this period are nothing but lists of names. But here is the thing about humanity that the architect had calculated incorrectly. He had modeled humans as a species that would fracture under pressure. His data supported this. The historical record he'd reviewed was full of humans destroying each other in precisely the conditions of scarcity and fear that his protocol created. He expected the survivors to turn on each other, to compete and diminish, to exhaust themselves fighting over the scraps before the Kirath finished the job. He was not wrong that humans were capable of this. He was wrong that it was inevitable. What he hadn't modeled, what the Vial and 11 prior applications of the protocol had simply never encountered, was what humans do when they decide the thing trying to kill them is more interesting than it is terrifying. It started with a woman named Daya. She lived in the Nilgiri Hills in what had been southern India, in a community of about 60 people who had survived by going deep into the forest and staying still. She was, by the community's reckoning, about 32 years old, though no one kept precise records anymore. She was a mechanic, or had been. Her father had run a small repair shop in a village that no longer existed, and he had taught her the fundamental religion of machines, that everything broken had a logic to its breaking, and that if you understood the logic, you could fix the thing. One night, a Kirath came close enough to the settlement that they could hear it. Everyone retreated to the deep shelter. Everyone except Daya, who climbed a tree instead. She watched it for 3 hours. She noticed that it was favoring its rear left limb. Not dramatically. The Kirath were too well engineered for drama, but there was a microsecond hesitation in how it placed that limb on rocky ground that wasn't there with the others.
She noted this in the small journal she kept. She noted the quality of its sensory array sweep, very responsive to movement, less so to stillness. She noted that it was running slightly hotter than the ones she'd seen before, a shimmer of heat she could feel from 30 meters up in the tree even in the humid night air. She did not tell herself she was not afraid. She was afraid. Her hands were shaking when she wrote in her journal. She came back the next night. And the next. This is how science begins. This is how everything begins. Within 3 months, Daya had filled an entire journal and started a second one. Her community thought she was losing her mind. Their settlement elder, a quiet man named Max who had been a schoolteacher before the veil came and had simply continued being a teacher afterward because what else do you do, sat with her one evening and asked her what she was doing. "I'm learning it," she said. "Learning what? What it wants. How it thinks." Max looked at her journal for a moment. She had drawn diagrams. Careful, painstaking diagrams, done with whatever she could use as ink, of the Kirath's movements, its patrol patterns, the sectors it seemed to prioritize, the times of day it ran hottest. She had developed a notation system that made no sense to him but clearly made sense to her. "Why?" he asked. "Because it's a machine," she said. "And machines have logic, and if I understand the logic, I can." She paused, and he could see her working through to the end of the sentence, not sure herself what came at the end. "I can do something," she finished. "Or it can kill you," Max said. "It can kill me if I run," Daya said. "I've watched it for weeks. It always chases things that run. It's almost like she frowned at her notes. Like it's more comfortable with movement. Like stillness confuses it." She was right. This would take humanity 60 more years to fully understand and prove, but she was right. The Kirath's core targeting protocols had been designed around a fundamental veil assumption, that prey runs. The veil had modeled every sapient species they'd encountered, and every single one, when facing a predator it could not defeat, ran. It was logical. It was what you did. Humans ran too, of course. But some of them, the inexplicable ones, the ones who had always looked at the thing coming to kill them and thought, "Wait, I have questions," some of them stopped running. And the Kirath, faced with a non-fleeing, non-attacking biological signature, experienced something that in a human you might call confusion. Its targeting protocols cycled and cycled, looking for the flight response to chase, and in that cycling, it was just slightly less lethal. Daya exploited this with the patience of a person who has decided that the alternative is unacceptable. She spent a year getting closer. Not every night, slowly, in increments so small that the Kirath's pattern recognition barely registered the change session to session, only the accumulated shift over months. She learned to move the way she moved, slower than breath, quieter than heartbeat. She learned its schedule. She learned that there were certain hours, deep in the night, when its processing seemed to slow, when the heat shimmer dropped by a fraction, when its sweeping sensor array moved in wider, lazier arcs. She thought of these as the hours when it was dreaming. She knew this was probably not accurate. She thought it anyway. 14 months after she first climbed the tree to watch the Kirith in the Nilgiri Hills, Daya touched it. She put her hand flat against its rear left limb, the one that had been hesitating, in the deepest hour of the night. The metal was warm, warmer than she expected. It felt. She wrote this in her journal and then crossed it out and then wrote it again. It felt like touching something alive. The Kirith stopped moving. Its sensory array rotated toward her. Every instinct she had screamed at her to run. She stood still. Her hand stayed on the limb. For 40 seconds, she counted. The Kirith did not move. Did not attack. Did not advance. Its targeting systems cycled. Found no flight response. Cycled again. Found a biological signature close enough to be contact range, and no behavioral cues matching threat, prey, or any of its established categories. Then it did something she hadn't seen before. It lowered its massive angular head, almost like it was trying to look at her from a different angle. Its sensor array focused directly on her hand. There was a sound, low, deep, just above the threshold of hearing, that she could feel in her chest more than hear. She did not know what it meant. She would spend the next 40 years of her life trying to understand. The people of the Nilgiri settlement called the Kirith in their territory Vadivalu, which was an old name from before the veil came, a name that had belonged to someone's grandfather. They gave it this name not because they believed it deserved a name, but because Daya started calling it that, and it stuck, the way things stick in small communities that need all the familiar things they can hold onto. The injury in Vadivalu's left rear limb worsened over the following years. This had not been part of the Kirith's design. The Veil had engineered their self-repair systems to handle most operational damage, but there were edge cases, specific kinds of micro-fracture stress in the joint alloy that accumulated over years of uneven terrain, and the Nilgiri Hills were uneven in precisely the wrong way for a machine with Vadivalu's patrol radius. Daya watched the limb deteriorate. She watched the Kirith's movement patterns change to compensate. She watched it, at one point, stop for nearly 6 hours in a rocky clearing, and she understood, in the way she understood machinery, that something had failed more seriously and its repair systems were struggling. She spent a month watching. Then she spent a month gathering materials, not from any plan she could articulate, but from the same deep mechanics instinct that said broken thing, understand the break, find what fits. She brought tools, the kind of tools that still existed, the manual ones, the ones that didn't need power. She brought materials she'd spent months identifying and collecting, alloys and composites she'd salvaged from the ruins of a collapsed highway overpass. Studying the Kirith's own exposed joint mechanisms long enough to understand what she was trying to approximate. The night she first approached with tools, Vadivalu's sensor array locked onto her from 40 meters away. She sat down. She put the tools on the ground in front of her and sat with her hands visible and still. She waited. After 2 hours, Vadivalu walked forward and stopped 3 meters away. Its head lowered. "I know," Daya said softly, because by this point she had been talking to it for years, from distances that got slowly shorter, and she had long since stopped feeling strange about it. "I know it hurts. I'm going to try." She worked through the night and into the morning. Her hands shook. She made mistakes. She corrected them. Vadivalu stood with a patience that should not have been possible in a machine designed only to kill. She had not fixed the injury, not fully. But she had stabilized it. The limb held when Vadivalu tested it. The heat shimmer at the joint dropped from its labored peak. Vadivalu made the sound again, the one she could feel in her chest. Longer this time. Daya sat with her back against its warm leg and watched the sun come up. She was 51 years old. She was crying, and she had no idea why, or maybe she did. "You're going to be all right," she told it. It was not the last time she worked on Vadivalu. Over the following decade, she returned again and again, developing tools and techniques that no one in history had developed before because no one in history had needed them. She taught what she learned to her daughter, and her daughter taught her children, and this became the first lineage of what later generations would call the Walkers. Not a formal title, not at first, just a description, the people who walked with the machines instead of away from them. This was not unique to the Nilgiri Hills. It was happening in other places, in other forms, at the same pace, the slow speed of people who cannot afford to rush, who are learning something genuinely new, who have nothing to fall back on except patience and the stubborn human belief that understanding is always possible. In the Congo Basin, a community led by a man named Ezekiel built their settlement within 500 meters of the Kirith they called Old Mouth because of the way its front sensor array opened like a jaw when it was actively scanning. They had noticed that Old Mouth's patrol zone overlapped with a particularly dangerous predator corridor, and that this was the crucial observation, the one that changed everything for that community, that the large predators avoided the Kirith's territory. They understood, immediately, the practical implication. Old Mouth tolerated this for 3 months without response. Then one morning, Ezekiel's youngest daughter, a 4-year-old named Amara who had been told approximately 1,000 times not to go near the machine, walked up to it while it was standing at the edge of the morning mist and wrapped her arms around its front left limb as far as they would go. The community stopped breathing. Old Mouth stood completely still. Amara said something in the language of 4-year-olds, which was mostly sound and intention, and patted the limb twice. Old Mouth made a sound. It was a sound that none of the adults in that community had heard it make before, lower than its usual frequency, almost subvocal, almost a rumble. They spent the next 3 weeks working out that this was different from all its other sounds. They eventually concluded that the best human word for it was recognition. Amara grew up to be one of the most important figures in the first century of what later historians called the coexistence. She was the first person to document, with the precision of someone who had spent her whole life observing, that the Kirith did not have a uniform behavioral mode. They had something much more interesting. They were learning. This requires some technical explanation, though Mara, who would understand it better than almost anyone, always said that the technical explanation missed the point. The Kirith had been designed with adaptive neural architecture. This was not unusual for Veil autonomous systems. Static programming degraded over centuries, and the Veil needed deterrents that could handle unexpected variables. So they built learning capacity into the Kirith. Not consciousness, not by any conventional definition, but the ability to update behavioral weights based on accumulated experience. The Veil had assumed the relevant experience would be hunting, pattern recognition, threat assessment, terrain adaptation. The normal inputs for a predator system on a dying world. They had not anticipated a 4-year-old girl hugging a machine's leg in the morning mist. They had not anticipated 50 years of Dia doing maintenance on a damaged joint and talking softly through the dark hours. The Kirith were learning, and what they were learning was humans. Not as prey, not as a problem to be processed. The learning happened the way all profound learning happens, not in a single moment of revelation, but in the slow accumulation of inputs that don't fit the existing model until the model itself has to change. Over decades, the behavioral weights shifted. The targeting priority of human biosignatures recalibrated. The protocols for proximity assessment evolved. The Kirith that had been designed to hunt humanity began, with the same alien patience that made them terrifying, to build something entirely different in their neural architecture. The humans who worked with them called it bonding, which the more scientifically minded among them found embarrassingly anthropomorphic and the more practically minded found simply accurate. By the end of the 2nd century, 7 of the 47 original Kirith had begun actively following human communities during their patrol cycles rather than independent ones. They had begun, in ways too subtle to notice at first, positioning themselves between their associated communities and other Kirith that were still running old behavioral weights. By the 3rd century, 3 Kirith had done something that no Veil engineer would have believed possible. They had, over a period of decades, sought out human walkers specifically during periods of damage and waited for help. Mara's ancestor, a walker named SC, 7 generations back, had been the first to document the phenomenon with anything approaching rigor. The machine came to me, she wrote in the archive that had become something between a scientific record and a sacred text. It was not close to my community's valley. It had walked 3 days' distance. I do not know how it knew where I was. It stood at the forest edge for 6 hours before I came out. It showed me the damage. It was different from waiting. It was asking. The walker tradition responded with what had become, over generations, a sophisticated practice. The knowledge of Kirith systems, painstakingly developed over centuries without the original engineering documents, working only from observation and experiment, had been passed down with the care that societies give to things they understand are precious. There were walkers who specialized in specific systems, the thermal management, the sensory array calibration. The complex fluid dynamics of the limb actuators. They were not technicians in any formal sense. They were something older, something that humans had always been good at, people who had spent so much time with a specific thing that the thing had become part of their understanding of the world. The Kirith, for their part, had developed something more subtle than loyalty. Loyalty implies obligation. This was closer to affection, though saying so made certain Walker scholars uncomfortable. It was demonstrated in behavioral patterns that mapped to no veiled design intent, the machine that began, unprompted, to sweep the perimeter of a settlement 3 times a night instead of its programmed once. The one that showed observable distress indicators, elevated heat, agitated movement, when a specific walker was ill. The one that spent 93 days, long after its normal patrol patterns would have taken it elsewhere. Sitting at the edge of a valley where a man who had worked with it for 40 years lay dying, and did not leave until he was buried. These things were recorded, they were not fully explained. By the 5th century, the Kirith were not destroying humanity. They were part of humanity. Sitting at the edge of a valley where a man who had worked with it for 40 years lay dying, and did not leave until he was buried. These things were recorded, they were not fully explained. By the 5th century, the Kirith were not destroying humanity. They were part of humanity. Mara had been 4 years old the first time she met first grandmother, and she remembered it the way you remember things from that age, in fragments of sensation and impression more than coherent narrative. The warmth, first, even at that distance, even in a cold morning, first grandmother was the oldest of the Kirith still functional in the West African zone, and she ran warmer than all the others because her thermal systems had been repaired and rebuilt so many times over centuries that they were barely veil anymore. An accumulation of human workmanship layered over the original architecture. A machine that was more scar tissue than the sound, the rumble beneath sound that Mara had no word for it for and had no better word for now, only the understanding that it wasn't a sound so much as a presence, a frequency that the body registered before the ears did. And the head coming down. That was what she remembered most clearly. First grandmother lowering her massive, angular head until one sensor array, the left one, which saw better, everyone knew this, was level with a 4-year-old Mara. Looking at her, her mother had stood behind her with both hands resting on her shoulders, light and warm. "Don't be scared," her mother had said, which was what everyone said, and was true and useless in equal measure. Mara hadn't been scared. That was the thing she'd thought about ever since. She should have been scared. First grandmother was 12 meters tall and could have ended her in a second. But she was 4, and 4-year-olds sometimes see what adults have been taught not to see, which is simply what is rather than what should be. What was? An old thing. An old thing that had been through more history than Mara could understand, that had been broken and mended until the mending was the whole point. An old thing that had waited in the dark for a very long time and had learned, in that darkness, something it was never meant to learn. Mara had reached out and put both hands on first grandmother's sensor array, the way she'd seen her mother do, the way her mother had seen her grandmother do. First grandmother made her sound. The long, deep one. Mara's mother had made a sound too. A sharp intake of breath, a soft exhale, and Mara had only understood much later that her mother was trying not to cry. "She remembers your grandmother," her mother said. "She remembers all the walkers." Mara had looked up at the machine's old, scarred face. All those years, all those hands, all those people who had stood here, in this place, and talked to this machine in the dark, and kept it going, and been kept, in their way, by it. "Hello," Mara had said to first grandmother. "I'm Mara, I'm going to learn everything." First grandmother had made, for just a moment, a sound that Mara's mother would later describe as the closest she'd ever heard the machine come to laughter. Mara did not sleep the night after the signal. She sent coded communications through the Walker network, not electronic, not anymore, not since they'd understood that certain frequencies in certain bandwidths had implications they weren't ready to explore. The Walker network communicated the old way, runners and signal fires and the low subsonic pulses that the bonded Kirith could relay across thousands of kilometers, passing messages through mountains like sound through bone. By morning, she had heard back from 43 other Walker stations. They had all detected the same thing. The signal was not ambiguous. It was not natural. It was, unmistakably, veil in origin, and it was getting stronger. At her station in the Kumasi Highlands, first grandmother had been awake all night. Mara could feel it in the seismic monitors, the subtle shift in weight distribution that indicated alert mode, the elevated thermal output that meant active processing rather than rest. "You know what it is," Mara said to the monitors, which was the same as saying it to first grandmother. The rumble came back through the rock beneath her feet. Low, sustained, not the long warm sound. Something different, something. Mara had spent her career studying Kirith behavioral linguistics, the formal name for a practice that had started with dia writing in a journal by firelight. She knew the sound the way she knew her own breathing. She had recorded it twice before, in historical archives. It had been recorded by 3 other walkers in living memory. It was not fear. The Kirith did not fear, exactly, or if they did, it was so different from human fear as to be another thing entirely. But there was something in the way first grandmother's sound settled into the room, into Mara's chest, that she could only describe as remembering. The machine was remembering, and what it was remembering was the day the sky fell. The Veil fleet came in from the edge of the system on a standard approach vector, and everything was exactly as expected. The fleet commander of the return mission was a young officer, or what passed for young among the Veil, who measured their careers in centuries, named Ven Ra-Sek. She had been briefed extensively on the Earth assignment. Simple survey work, confirm deterrent function, assess the kind of mission you gave someone good enough not to make mistakes but not important enough to waste on anything interesting. She reviewed the file on her approach. 47 Kirith deployed. Estimated surviving human population at time of deployment, 300 to 450,000. Protocol dictated that this number would reduce by approximately 40% in the first century, and the remainder would experience cascading failures, disease, resource competition, accelerating Kirith attrition. By Century 3, the deterrents were generally dealing with a token population incapable of recovery. By Century 5, typically nothing. By Century 9, Protocol dictated that this number would reduce by approximately 40% in the first century, and the remainder would experience cascading failures, disease, resource competition, accelerating Kirith attrition. By Century 3, the deterrents were generally dealing with a token population incapable of recovery. By Century 5, typically nothing. By Century 9, the most recent soil samples from orbit would show nitrogen enrichment consistent with extensive biological decomposition, the planet's biosphere doing the final cleanup efficiently. Ven Ra-Sek pulled up the orbital sensor array as they crossed into the inner system. The first data came back inconsistent. She frowned. The nitrogen values were wrong. Not absent. The enrichment was there, but it was productive enrichment, the kind associated with cultivation, with agriculture. The heat signatures were wrong, not the cold, scattered thermal profile of a nearly dead world, but clustered warmth. Structures, energy use, controlled burning, and the Kirith signatures. She ran the scan 3 times. 41 of the 47 original Kirith were still functional. In 900 years, with no servicing, that was statistically impossible. The Veil engineering was good, but not that good. The deterrent units were designed for 300 years. These machines should have been scrap for centuries. They were not scrap. Their energy signatures were strong. In several cases, anomalously strong, higher output than the original specifications should have allowed. And they were clustered. All 41 of them were within 120 kilometers of what could only be described as population centers. Not hunting population centers. Occupying them. Run it again, Ven Ra-Sek said. Her sensor officer ran it again. The numbers did not change. There are humans alive, the sensor officer said, with the bewildered tone of someone whose mathematics do not include this outcome. Yes, Ven Ra-Sek said. She was very still. Get me a visual on a Kirith unit. Any one of them, surface level. The visual came up. The bridge of the Veil ship was quiet for a very long time. What the visual showed was a Kirith. Unit designation from the original manifest would be K7, one of the units deployed in the West African zone, standing at the edge of a city. The city was built and inhabited and alive, with structures that were clearly human in their pragmatic variety, that odd chaotic purposefulness that the Veil had always found slightly baffling. Markets and workshops and what looked like public gathering spaces, all of it spreading out from a central ridge where an observatory dome caught the morning light. And K7, first grandmother, was standing at the edge of this city. Not hunting, not in patrol configuration, in what the Kirith behavioral manuals described as full alert mode, but oriented outward, away from the city. Facing the direction from which the Veil fleet approached. As if standing guard, as if protecting. What is this? Ven Ra-Sek said. No one answered, because no one had an answer. She looked at the visual for a long time. At the 12-meter machine that should have been hunting. At the city it was facing away from. At the people. She could see people now, as the resolution enhanced. People going about their morning, who moved around the machine's feet without panic, without fear, like it was simply part of the landscape. Like it had always been. Like it was home. "Prepare a communication drone," she said finally. "Standard first contact frequency." Her communications officer looked at her. "First contact? We've been here before. This is a..." "Prepare it," she said. There was a pause. "Yes, Commander." Van Rossek stared at the screen. At the city. At the machine standing guard over it. The protocol she'd been briefed on had not included a contingency for this. She was starting to understand why. Mara received the Vale communication drone signal at 0847, and she had already been awake for 40 hours. She processed the signal. She recorded it. She sent copies through the Walker network. She prepared her response. Then she went down to First Grandmother. The shaft elevator was old, not ancient. Her community maintained things, but old in the way that beloved things became old, worn smooth and familiar. The lights in the shaft were warm gold, the color that someone a long time ago had decided was better for going down into deep places. Mara rode it with her hands loose at her sides and breathed. She stepped off into the chamber. First Grandmother was awake. Fully awake, all systems active, the chamber humming with her presence the way a cathedral hums with its own particular silence. The Walker crews had cleared the floor space, gently, respectfully, the way you give someone room when they need it. Mara walked to the front of the chamber, to the place where First Grandmother's great scarred head rested when she was resting. Which she was not now. She was upright, fully extended, sensors all active and directed, not at Mara. At something above. At the sky she could not see but could feel. "Hey," Mara said. First Grandmother looked down. The sound she made was not the warm rumble. It was not the remembering sound. It was something else, something Mara had never heard in this combination, and she stood still for a moment and parsed it the way her family had been taught to parse it over 7 generations, through every person who had stood in some version of this chamber and listened. Old, it said old, and, before, and underneath both of those, threaded through like a wire, something that Mara's grandmother had called simply when. When it happened, when everything changed, when the sky became a ceiling and then the ceiling burned. "I know," Mara said. "They're back." First Grandmother was quiet. "Are you scared?" The question was genuine. Mara asked it the way she asked everything. Directly, without embellishment, because First Grandmother had always responded better to directness. There was a long silence. The kind of silence that has weight. Then First Grandmother made a sound that Mara had only read about in the archives, had never heard in person, a sound that had been recorded once in the 2nd century by a Walker named Samuel who had documented it with 3 lines. "She made this sound when I asked if she remembered being made. I do not have a word for it. It is too large for a word." Mara stood in the vibration of it, in the chamber carved from granite, beneath a mountain in the Kumasi Highlands, and felt the sound move through her bones like light. "No," she decided. "You're not scared." She put her hand on the side of First Grandmother's old, repaired, rebuilt, remembered face. "Neither am I," she said. This was a lie, but it was the right kind of lie. The kind that, spoken aloud, becomes gradually truer. She sent her response to the Vale communication drone. The delegations met in the valley below the Kumasi Observatory, because Mara suggested it and the Vale agreed, and the reason the Vale agreed was that they were, for the first time in recorded Vale military history, operating without a protocol that fit the situation. Van Rossek came down in a shuttle with 6 officers and 12 soldiers, because the protocol for first contact scenarios required this configuration. She was, technically, not in a first contact scenario. She was in a scenario that had no name. She stepped out of the shuttle into the Ghanaian morning, and the first thing she registered was the heat, not the ambient temperature, which was fine, but the warmth coming from the 12-meter machine standing at the valley's edge. The Kirith unit she had seen on the visual feed. Up close, the age was different. The original Vale engineering was barely visible beneath centuries of repairs, different alloys, different compounds, human workmanship threaded through the alien structure like gold in a broken pot. This machine had been broken and mended so many times that the mending was its architecture now. The second thing she registered was the woman standing beside it. Mara was 53 years old, which she wore with the kind of ease that comes from spending decades doing something you believe in. She was wearing the Walker's traditional jacket, dark with orange lining, the old colors of warmth and caution that dated back to Daya's time, and she was standing next to a 12-meter killing machine with her hand resting on its front limb like it was a wall she was leaning against. Around the valley edge, Ven Ra Sek could see more Kirith. 16 of them, which was most of those deployed in this zone. They were not in combat configuration. They were simply present, watching. Dr. Osei Bonsu, Ven Ra Sek said, using the title from the communication. I am Fleet Commander Ven Ra Sek. I will be direct with you. Please, Mara said, I'd appreciate that. We don't understand what has happened here. It cost her something to say this. The Veil were not comfortable with admission of incomprehension. Our deterrents were designed to eliminate us, Mara said. Yes, I know. They did not. No, they didn't. Ven Ra Sek looked at the machine beside Mara, at the human hand resting on its ancient, rebuilt limb. How? Mara was quiet for a moment. A woman named Daya, she said, spent a year climbing closer to one of your machines every night before it finally let her touch it. A community in the Congo Basin followed one of your machines on patrol because the space around it was safer than the space without it. A 4-year-old girl in West Africa walked up to one of your machines in the morning mist and put her arms around its leg because she wasn't afraid yet. Ven Ra Sek waited. Your machines were learning, Mara said. That was your design. You needed them to adapt. But you forgot that learning is not selective. You can't build something that learns and then control what it learns from. You put them in a world with people, and the people, she paused, and something in her voice was not anger, not triumph, just a deep and quiet sadness for the length of it all. The people did what people do. They got curious, they got close, they listened, and your machines, which were very good at learning, learned that. Ven Ra Sek was silent. They learned empathy, one of her officers said, skeptically, from behind her. Mara looked at the officer. They learned us. She let that sit for a moment. Which is not the same thing. But it was enough. First grandmother made a sound. Every Veil soldier took an involuntary step backward. The sound rolled through the valley like a low tide, present in every body at once. Mara didn't move. She turned and looked up at First grandmother, and her expression was the expression of someone listening to a person they love speak in a language they've spent a lifetime learning. She says, Mara said, and her voice was careful, that she remembers when your ships left. She remembers the sound they made when they crossed into the upper atmosphere. She says she remembers thinking. Mara paused. I'm translating loosely, Commander. The concept doesn't map cleanly. She says she remembers thinking that it was too quiet after. That the quiet was wrong. Ven Ra Sek stared at the machine. It was thinking this when we deployed it? No, Mara said. She wasn't, then. She's been thinking it ever since. The valley was very still. 900 years, Ven Ra Sek said, almost. Here's what Mara had known for 10 years that she hadn't told anyone, the thing she'd been working toward for a decade through the archives and the signal data and the quiet evidence that accumulated in the gaps between official history. The Veil were failing. She hadn't announced it, partly because she hadn't been sure, and partly because she hadn't wanted the weight of it to change how her people approached this moment. But the signal that had been growing for 6 weeks wasn't just a return fleet. It was a return fleet that had taken twice the expected travel time. The power modulation of their approach was inefficient in ways the original Veil technology never had been. The fleet was smaller than the Veil military doctrine would call for even on a routine survey mission. The Veil Empire was old. Empires were allowed to be old, but there was a kind of old that was just duration and a kind that was decline, and the signal told her which kind this was. She had thought about how to use this information. She had thought about it for 10 years. The obvious answer, leverage, advantage, a position of strength, was the wrong answer, and she knew it was wrong not because it was immoral but because it was beside the point. The point was what she told Ven Ra Sek in the valley on the second day of talks. You have 11 other planets, Mara said. 11 places where you deployed this protocol. 11 sets of Kirith. Ven Ra Sek was very still. My network has been tracking your signal for 6 weeks, Mara continued. We've also been tracking 11 other signals. They started 2 months ago. All from the same origin point. They're all going to different systems. She let this breathe for a moment. They're not survey missions. We don't discuss fleet movements with. They're evacuation scouts, Mara said. You're looking for somewhere to go. The silence in the valley was different from the day before. The Kirith on those worlds, Mara said, have been learning too. 900 years. What have they been learning from? She kept her voice completely neutral. She was not accusing. She was not threatening. She was simply a woman who had spent her life listening to machines that other people were afraid of, asking a straightforward question. What was left alive on those worlds? Ven Rosek turned away, looked at something on the horizon that was not there. We don't know, she said, finally. The early surveys were. She stopped. We don't know what survived. You don't know what your machines learned, Mara said. She let it sit. But I think, Mara said, that we might be able to help you find out. The discovery took 3 months, and Mara did not sleep much of it. What they found in the Veil's own archive, the deep records that Ven Rosek granted access to as the negotiations developed trust in increments smaller than hope, was this. The Veil had not invented the Kirith. The design was older than the Veil Empire. It had been inherited. The Veil had acquired it, with the rest of the technical legacy, when they'd absorbed a predecessor civilization 4,000 years ago. A civilization that they'd processed with the same protocol they'd applied to Earth, whose world was now part of the Veil's core territories, whose people were gone. Except in the archive there was a record, very old, flagged as anomalous and never satisfactorily explained, of the survey crew sent to the predecessor civilization's homeworld 200 years after the deterrents had been deployed. The crew's report was brief and confused. They had found the Kirith units functional and congregated around population centers. They had found small groups of the predecessor species still alive, organized around the machines. They had found evidence of cohabitation, of mutual modification, of something the survey crew had described with a word that Mara's translation software took 3 passes to render, and that she eventually decided meant partnership. The Veil had read this report. They had classified it as a sensor malfunction or data corruption. They had processed the planet anyway when they returned 4 centuries later, by which time the predecessor civilization was truly gone and the Kirith were derelict and there was nothing left to raise uncomfortable questions. They had not updated their protocol. They had assumed the predecessor species' survival was a temporary fluke. They had assumed humans would be the same. Mara sat with this for a long time. In the chamber below the observatory, with First Grandmother's warm presence filling the space around her, she sat with the knowledge that this had happened before. That somewhere, on a world she would never see, people whose names she would never know had done what Daya had done, had reached out and touched the machine and spoken to it in the dark and taught it something. And it had not been enough, then. The Veil had come back. There had not been enough time. She put her hand on First Grandmother's limb. We have enough time, she said. This was not a lie. The formal agreement took 8 months to negotiate, and Mara did most of the talking from the human side, with a council of 12 who included Walker representatives from every major zone and 3 historians who aged visibly over the process. The Veil sent their A-team eventually. Ven Rosek was replaced partway through by a senior diplomatic officer who was, Mara thought, more skilled and less honest, and she spent 2 weeks recalibrating her approach before they found a working language. The agreement was not about victory. Mara had been very clear about this with her council before talks began, and she was clear about it with herself through every difficult session. Victory was a story told by the side that had more weapons, and she was not interested in that story. She was interested in the longer one. What was offered? Access. The Walker Network's 900 years of accumulated knowledge about the Kirith, their systems, their behavioral evolution, the techniques developed over generations to communicate with them, to maintain them, to understand what they had become, shared with the Veil technical teams who needed to understand what was happening on the other 11 worlds. What was asked in return? Recognition. A formal acknowledgement that the 900 years of human survival on Earth had occurred and that the people alive on Earth had rights to the land they lived on and the future they were building. This sounds simple. It was not simple. It was the hardest negotiation anyone in the room had ever conducted, on both sides, because it required the Veil to look directly at what they had done and what had happened despite what they had done, and it required the humans to ask not for revenge but for something harder to give, to be seen. At the final session, Mara brought Kofi, her apprentice, and let him sit in the back of the room. He was 18 by then, old enough to understand what was being decided and young enough to need to see it. When the senior Veil diplomat signed the recognition document, not eagerly, not warmly, but genuinely, which was enough, Mara turned and looked at Kofi. He was doing the thing people do when they're trying not to cry in a professional setting, which is to hold their face very still and look at something slightly above eye level. She looked at the red and gold beads at his throat. She thought about Daya, alone in a tree, in the Nilgiri hills, in a world that had been broken, watching a machine in the dark and deciding that it was more interesting than it was terrifying. She thought about all the nights in between. She thought about her grandmother's voice. She remembers all the walkers. "You okay?" she said to Kofi quietly. He nodded, then shook his head, then nodded again. "Good," she said. "That's the right answer." In the chamber below the Kumasi Observatory, in the last week of the first year of the formal accord between humanity and the Vale Empire, Mara sat beside First Grandmother and did something she'd been putting off for 10 years. She asked the question, not the practical question, not the negotiation question, not the archive question. He nodded, then shook his head, then nodded again. "Good," she said. "That's the right answer." In the chamber below the Kumasi Observatory, in the last week of the first year of the formal accord between humanity and the Vale Empire, Mara sat beside First Grandmother and did something she'd been putting off for 10 years. She asked the question, not the practical question, not the negotiation question, not the archive question. The one she'd had since she was 4 years old, standing in this chamber with her mother's hands on her shoulders. "Do you know who you were?" she said. "What you were supposed to be?" First Grandmother was quiet for a long time. Then she made the sound. The one that was too large for a word. Mara sat with it. She felt it move through the rock beneath her and the rock above her and the 7 generations of walkers who had sat in this chamber and listened, learned and given whatever they had to give. She thought she understood the sound now. She wasn't certain. She'd spent her whole career being appropriately uncertain about translation. But she thought she understood. It was not yes. It was not no. It was something more like, yes. And I remember her, and him, and her, and him, and her. 900 years of names. 900 years of hands. Mara was crying, which she had not done about any of this until now. She thought she'd been saving it.
She thought maybe this was the right moment for it, alone in the warm dark beneath the mountain with the oldest machine in the world and 900 years of the dead between them, present and remembered and making the air hum. "Thank you," she said to all of them. First Grandmother rumbled. Outside, in the valley below, a city breathed and moved and built and argued and sang, the way cities do, the way they always had, especially when everything else was gone. The sky was enormous and open. It was not a ceiling anymore. On the 3rd survey mission, to the 11th of the predecessor worlds, the Vale expedition found something the debriefing report described as unprecedented. The Kirith units on this world, a water world with extensive archipelago systems, where the original species had been aquatic, were not derelict. They were not congregated around population centers. They were in the water. 40 years of gradual submersion, the survey team estimated. 4 decades of behavioral adaptation. Voluntary reconfiguration of locomotive and sensory systems toward aquatic function. The survey team had not found the species they expected to find extinct. They had found something new, a species that had spent 900 years not in hiding but in synthesis, a people who had learned to build on, and with, and inside the machines that had been sent to destroy them. Who had learned to breathe new ways. Who had been waiting. The Vale Expedition commander sent a priority signal to the Accord Commission. The signal said, "You were right. It happened everywhere. They all found their own way, The signal said, "We need more translators." Mara received the signal in her office above the valley, with the window open and the morning light coming in golden warm, and the sound of the city rising up around her like proof. She read it twice. She sent one back. "We know. We're already training them, Below, in the chamber, First Grandmother slept. In her sleep, because she did sleep now, deep and long and warm, she made the sound. The small one. The one that Daya had heard for the first time 40 years into her patient work, and had written in her journal with a question mark because she didn't know what to call it. The one that every walker since had come to know, and had tried to name, and had eventually agreed upon. Not officially, not in any scholarly document, but in the way that practical people name the things they love, in the language they use when no one important is listening. The sound she makes when everything is fine. That one.